The morning of her wedding, Alara packed one bag. Not because she was running. She had nowhere to run to. She packed it because it felt like the last honest thing she could do for herself, choose what came with her into whatever life was waiting on the other side of this day. A worn copy of her mother's poetry book. 2 letters she'd never sent. A small jar of dried lavender that still smelled like the house she'd grown up in before everything fell apart. Her sister knocked twice, then walked in without waiting for an answer. That had always been Priya's way. The world was hers to enter whenever she pleased. "You're not dressed," Priya said, looking at Alara's plain cotton robe like it was a personal offense. "I'm aware. The ceremony is in 3 hours. I know when my own wedding is." Priya sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wrinkle her own dress. She was a bridesmaid, which was almost funny. Almost, are you going to cry the whole time? Because mother's already fragile, and if you start, I'm not going to cry. Alara set the lavender jar in the bag. "I'm not going to feel anything." "That's the plan." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, softer. "He's not what the stories say. Maybe it won't be, don't." Alara finally looked at her. "Don't do that. Don't stand in my room with your normal life waiting for you outside this door and tell me it might not be terrible." Her sister looked away. The dress came an hour later, carried in by 2 women from the Vampire King's household who didn't speak a word of her language. It was beautiful. Of course it was. Heavy white silk that caught light like water, embroidered along the collar with something that looked like old script. Alara stood still while they dressed her, staring at the wall, letting her mind go somewhere quieter. She thought about a conversation she'd had once with her father, years ago, before the debt started. He'd taken her to the river on a winter morning, and they'd stood there watching ice form at the edges of the water. He'd said something she'd never forgotten. He'd said sometimes the river doesn't choose where it goes. It just keeps moving, because stopping means freezing. She'd thought that was beautiful at 12 years old. Now it just sounded like an excuse adults told themselves. The carriage that took her to the estate was black, lined with dark velvet, and utterly silent. No attendants rode with her, just Alara, the bag at her feet, and the sound of horses on frozen ground. She pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched the city dissolve into forest. The trees here were old, enormous, the kind of trees that had watched centuries pass and simply kept growing, indifferent to everything beneath them. She had read about Calum Voss exactly once. There wasn't much written about him that wasn't myth or rumor, and most of it contradicted itself. Some accounts said he was fair. Others said he had once destroyed an entire merchant family over a perceived slight at a dinner table. One account, the one she'd found, tucked inside a restricted section of the city library, said he had been searching for something for 200 years and hadn't found it, and had grown cold in the looking. She didn't know which version to believe. She supposed she was about to find out. The estate appeared through the trees like something that had grown there naturally, as if the forest had simply decided to become architecture one day. Stone towers. Ivy that had been growing so long it had become structural. Lights in every window despite the afternoon hour, warm and amber, which surprised her. She'd expected cold. She wasn't brought in through the front. A side entrance. Quiet, a housekeeper named Marta, who was human, surprisingly, and who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. "I'll take you to your rooms first. His Majesty will receive you at sunset for the ceremony." Just like that? Marta looked at her steadily. "Did you want something more complicated?" Alara laughed, a small involuntary sound. No, straightforward is good." The rooms they gave her were on the east wing, 2nd floor, overlooking a garden that was brown and dormant, but enormous. She could see the bones of what it would be in spring. Someone had cared about this garden, once, maybe still did. She sat in the chair by the window and didn't move for a long time. At sunset, they came for her. The ceremony was small. Witnesses from his household. An officiant who read words in a language she half understood. Alara stood in her white silk dress that hadn't been made for her and looked at the man she was marrying for the first time. He was taller than she'd imagined. Dark hair, pale skin, the kind of stillness that didn't look like calm, it looked like something enormous, holding itself very carefully in check. His eyes found hers immediately, and she had the strange sensation of being read, very quickly, like a letter someone had been expecting. He didn't smile. She didn't either. They said the words, signed the papers. His hand touched hers for exactly as long as was required, and no longer. Cold fingers. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was how formal it felt, how transactional, how much it felt like two people agreeing to a business arrangement neither of them had chosen. Which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. Afterward, when the witnesses had gone, and the officiant had bowed his way out of the room, Calum Voss turned to face her. The great hall was very quiet. A fire burned at the far end, and he looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Then he said, very quietly, like it cost him something to say it, "I will never touch you. I want you to know that from tonight. This is an arrangement. Your life here will be comfortable. You'll have freedom within the estate. I'll make no demands." Alara looked at him. "Which room is yours?" she asked. He blinked. Just slightly. "North wing." "And mine is east?" "Yes, good," she said. "Then we won't have to avoid each other too hard." She picked up her bag from where she'd left it by the door and walked toward the east wing stairs. She did not look back. He stood in the great hall alone, staring at the space where she'd been, and for the first time in a very long time. Calum Voss had absolutely no idea what to do next. She didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, exactly. It was more that the bed was too large, the room too unfamiliar, and her brain too loud with the specific silence of a place she didn't know yet. Every house has its own nighttime sounds the particular way pipes settle, which floorboards complain, where wind finds gaps. She didn't know this house's sounds. It made everything feel slightly unreal, like she was sleeping inside someone else's life. She lay on her back with the blanket pulled to her chin and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing useful. Around midnight, she gave up and got up. Her bag was still packed. She found this almost funny. Some part of her had clearly not believed she was staying. She pulled out her mother's poetry book and sat cross-legged on the enormous bed and read for a while by lamplight. Old poems, ink slightly faded, her mother's handwriting in the margins. Not annotations, just feelings. A small star next to lines she loved. Question marks next to ones she didn't understand. The word yes, written once, next to a stanza about surviving winter. Alara had never asked her mother what she'd meant by that yes. She wished she had. At some point she went to the window. The garden was silver gray in the moonlight, all those dormant plants casting long shadows across the frozen earth. And then she noticed something that made her go very still. There was a light in the corridor outside her room, just visible in the small gap beneath her door, a faint, warm amber light that hadn't been there when she'd come to bed. She stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then she opened the door. Calum Voss was sitting on the floor in the corridor, his back against the wall opposite her door, long legs stretched out in front of him. He had a book in his hands. An actual book. Not for show, the spine was cracked from use. Several pages dog-eared. There was a single lamp beside him on the stone floor. He looked up when the door opened, and for a single unguarded moment, his expression was exactly like a man who had been caught doing something he hadn't planned to explain. Alara stared at him. "You're sitting outside my door," she said. "I'm reading," he said, with the specific tone of someone trying to make something strange sound very normal. In the corridor. It's a good corridor. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the book. She looked at him. He had changed out of the formal clothes from the ceremony. He was wearing something more like what a very old-fashioned person might consider casual dark trousers, a plain shirt, no jacket. He looked different this way. Less like a king. More like a person. "Why are you outside my door?" she asked again, more carefully this time. He was quiet for a moment. Then, old habit. He said it like that was a complete explanation. What does that mean? He looked back at his book, then seemed to decide something, and looked back up at her. "When my sister first came to live here, she was frightened of the estate at night. I used to sit outside her door until she fell asleep, so she knew someone was there." He paused. "You're not my sister. I'm aware this is different." Alara didn't say anything. "You didn't sleep," he continued. "It wasn't a question. I could hear you moving around." "You could hear that from the north wing?" He gave her a look that said, "I am a vampire. I could hear you breathing from the other side of the estate." "Right," she said. "I forgot about that part." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him properly for the first time, without a ceremony happening around them, without witnesses and officiants and the weight of formal words. He looked tired. Not the way humans looked tired. Something deeper, more structural. The way a building looks tired when it's been standing longer than anyone intended. "How old are you?" she asked. 263. "That's a long time to be awake." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one either. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." She slid down the doorframe and sat on the floor opposite him, back against the other wall, mirroring his position without really meaning to. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read: surprise, maybe, or something more careful than surprise. "I'm not frightened," she told him, "of the house, or you. You don't need to sit here." "I know," he said. He didn't move. She looked at his book. "What are you reading?" He tilted the cover toward her. It was a collection of old navigational charts, bound as a book. Not a story, not poetry. "Maps? You read maps," she said. "I find them calming." "Why?" He considered this seriously, which she hadn't expected. Most people, when asked why they liked something, said they didn't know or deflected into a joke. He actually thought about it. "They show you everywhere something leads," he said at last. "Every road has an end. Every river reaches water. There's something settled about that. Knowing everything arrives somewhere." She thought about her father at the river, the ice at the edges, the water that kept moving. "I have my mother's poetry book," she said, not sure why she was telling him this. She wrote in the margins, "I was reading it when I couldn't sleep." He nodded slowly. She died 4 years ago. "I'm sorry." He said it plainly, not the way people said it at funerals, practiced and packaged, just 2 words with some actual weight behind them. "Were you close?" he asked. "I thought we were," Alara said. "Then she died and I found out all the things she never told me. I think maybe close isn't the right word. I think we were parallel, moving in the same direction without ever quite touching." He was looking at her differently now, like she'd said something that meant more than its surface. "My mother was human," he said abruptly, like he'd decided to trade her honesty for honesty. She chose to stay human. "My father offered her immortality every decade for 60 years, and she said no each time." A pause. When she died, he didn't speak for 2 years. Just stopped speaking. Not from grief. He said everything he had left to say had been for her. The rest didn't seem worth the air. Alara felt something tighten in her chest. "They found each other, though," she said. 60 years. "Yes," Caleb said. He looked at the map in his lap. They did. They sat in the corridor for a long time after that, not saying very much, not needing to. The lamp burned between them, warm and small and steady, and outside the estate the winter wind moved through those enormous old trees, and somewhere a clock somewhere in the building struck 2, then 3. At some point Alara's eyes grew heavy. She woke up the next morning in her bed with no memory of getting there. Her mother's poetry book was on the nightstand, closed. The lamp from the corridor was on her dresser, extinguished but still warm. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Then she got up and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was enormous, and she got lost twice finding it. The estate had that quality older buildings sometimes have the architecture made sense if you already knew where everything was, and made almost no sense at all if you didn't. Corridors branched unexpectedly. Staircases appeared where she didn't expect them. She went through what she thought was a door to the ground floor and ended up in a room full of clocks. All stopped. All reading different times. She stood there for a moment, surrounded by silent clocks, and decided not to try to understand that room right now. She found the kitchen by following the smell of something warm. Marta was there, standing at a large stove, and she didn't look up when Alara came in. She just pointed at a stool on the other side of the kitchen counter and said, "Sit the way people talk to dogs and small children," which Alara found oddly comforting. She sat. "Tea or something stronger?" Marta asked. "Tea, please." A cup appeared in front of her. Strong, dark, no fuss. Exactly what she would have made herself. "How long have you worked here?" Alara asked. "Going on 40 years. Alara looked at her. Marta was maybe 65, with the kind of face that had weathered into something very specific and settled. "You came here when you were 25, yes. My mother worked here before me." And her mother before that. She said it simply, matter-of-factly. It's not a strange life, if you're used to it. "Is he?" Alara stopped. She wasn't sure how to ask what she wanted to ask. Marta gave her a look over the rim of her own cup that said, "Ask the question properly. Is he as complicated as he seems?" Marta set her cup down. She thought for a moment with the particular seriousness of someone who was going to tell you the truth rather than what was comfortable. "He's private," she said finally. "Deeply private. Not cold, even though he comes across that way. When his steward's daughter was sick 3 winters ago, he sat with her every night for a week, brought her books, read to her, didn't tell anyone he'd done it." She paused. "He doesn't like being seen being kind. I've never fully understood why." Alara thought about the corridor, the lamp on the stone floor, the maps. "What happened with his sister?" she asked. He mentioned her last night. Something shifted in Marta's expression. Just slightly. "She's not here anymore. Hasn't been for many years." "Did she leave?" "She died." Alara went quiet. "He doesn't speak about it," Marta said. "I'm telling you because you'll need to understand some things about him, and nobody else is going to explain them. He loved her very much, and he couldn't protect her, and he has never stopped punishing himself for that. It's the thing beneath everything else with him, the reason he holds the world at exactly this distance." She measured a small space between her thumb and forefinger. Close enough to see, far enough to keep safe. Alara sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You don't know me." "No," Marta agreed. "But I know him. And I've watched him for 40 years not let a single person pass that distance." She picked up her cup again. "You asked him why he was reading in the corridor last night instead of going back to bed." Alara blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because he came to the kitchen at 4 in the morning and stood there for 10 minutes before making himself tea. He only does that when something is sitting with him that he doesn't know what to do with." She looked at Alara steadily. "In 40 years, I have never seen him not know what to do with something." The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. Alara drank her tea. Later that morning, she explored. Not systematically, not with a plan. She just walked and let the house show her things. A music room with an enormous harp that looked like it hadn't been played in decades. Dust on the strings, but the body still polished. A library that took her actual breath away. 3 stories of books. A rolling ladder, light coming in from a glass ceiling. She stood inside it for a long moment, with her head tilted back, and thought she could survive almost anything if she had access to this room. She was standing on the 2nd level of the library, reading the spine of a book she didn't recognize, when she heard him come in. She knew it was him before she looked. There was something about the way the air in a room shifted when he entered it, some quality of attention, like everything in the room becoming slightly more aware of itself. She looked down from the railing. He was standing at the entrance, and he'd stopped when he saw her. The way a person stops when they find someone in a place they didn't expect anyone to be. "I didn't know you were in here," he said. "I didn't know it was reserved." "It's not." He came in fully. He was carrying something, a stack of papers, which he set on the large reading table in the center of the room. He didn't immediately start working. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the table and looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize as his thinking expression. Like whatever he was looking at deserved serious consideration before a response. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Eventually, she leaned on the railing. "Someone moved me back to my bed." "That was you. Not a question." "You were asleep on the floor," he said. "It seemed uncomfortable. Did you carry me?" He looked very slightly uncomfortable. "You're small. It didn't seem necessary to wake you." She stared at him. "You carried me to bed. You're reading that with an implication that isn't there. I'm not implying anything. I'm just—" She stopped. She'd been going to say she was surprised, but that wasn't quite right. "I'm trying to understand what the rules are," she said instead. "You told me last night this is an arrangement. You said you'd make no demands, and then you spent the night outside my door and carried me to bed when I fell asleep in the corridor." He was quiet. "I'm not complaining," she added. "I'm just trying to understand." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense again of being read quickly, thoroughly. "I don't know what the rules are either," he said finally. "I've made these arrangements before. Political marriages, contracts, they've always been straightforward." A pause. "You are not particularly straightforward. You've been married before?" "Twice. Both arrangements. Both managed." He said the word in a way that suggested managed was a very deliberately chosen word. Neither he stopped. Neither was like this. "Like what?" He looked away. Toward the books, the glass ceiling, anywhere other than directly at her. "I don't know yet," he said. She came down the ladder from the 2nd level and stood on the ground floor, a few feet from where he was. He was taller than she always slightly forgot when he wasn't immediately in front of her. She had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him properly. "The room full of stopped clocks," she said. "What's that about?" Something shifted in his expression. Almost softness. It was gone too quickly to be sure. "My sister collected them," he said. She thought it was romantic. Stopping time. He looked toward the library door, as if he could see through the walls to wherever that room was. "I haven't changed them. I know I should." "It's been," he stopped. "How long?" Alara asked quietly. 90 years. She didn't know what to say to that. "She would have liked you," he said abruptly, still not looking at her. She liked people who asked direct questions. She said most people were exhausting because they talked around things. A very brief pause. "You don't talk around things." Alara looked at him. This complicated, ancient, careful man standing in his own library, holding papers he'd come to read but hadn't opened yet. Talking about a sister he'd lost 90 years ago in a voice that made it sound like last week. "Tell me her name," Alara said. He looked at her. "You don't have to," she added. "But you said she'd have liked me." "I'd like to know her name." A long pause. The glass ceiling let in thin winter light that moved across the floor between them. "Saren," he said. "That's a beautiful name." "Yes," he said. "It is." 3 days passed before anything went wrong. Alara had started to find a rhythm inside the estate. Morning tea with Marta, who was becoming someone she genuinely looked forward to talking to. Long hours in the library, where she worked through the shelves systematically, pulling out anything that looked interesting and building a pile of books that now lived on the table in the reading room like a second project she'd claimed. Walks in the dead garden in the afternoon she'd taken to wearing one of the heavy coats she'd found in the hallway closet, dark wool that smelled faintly of cedar, and she walked the same paths every day trying to imagine what everything would look like in spring. She and Calum had an odd understanding that had developed without either of them planning it. He appeared in the library most mornings. She was already there. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just existed in the same room with their separate books and separate thoughts, and this was, she was discovering, something she didn't have a word for yet but that felt surprisingly like company. He had told her, the second morning, that the estate had a horse. She'd looked at him. "One?" She'd said. "I don't ride," he said. "She belonged to someone who did, and I kept her when they left." He'd paused. "I thought you might want something to do in the afternoons." The horse was a bay mare named completely inappropriately Biscuit, because Saren had named her at 3 years old, Marta had explained, and the name had simply stuck even after she'd grown into a large and somewhat dignified animal. Alara had gone to the stable that afternoon, and Biscuit had regarded her with the measured skepticism of a creature who had learned to be appropriately careful about newcomers, and then had allowed Alara to feed her an apple from the kitchen, and the relationship was established. Calum had watched this from the stable doorway. "You're good with her," he'd said. "I grew up with horses," Alara had said, before she'd stopped. He didn't push. He'd learned not to, she noticed. When she stopped mid-sentence, he waited, and if she didn't finish, he simply let the silence sit, without trying to fill it or prompt her. It was such a specific kind of consideration that she found herself noticing it every time. She told him anyway. Later, sitting in the library at the end of the second day, the lamp between them on the table. "My father had a business," she said. "Imports originally, then it expanded." Then she turned a page she wasn't reading. "He borrowed money he couldn't pay back. The horses went first. Then the house. Then there was the debt to your estate's treasury. Your marriage," Calum said quietly. "My marriage." She set down the book. "He didn't ask me. He told me. Over dinner, like it was a logistical matter that was already settled." She was quiet for a moment. He apologized afterward. Once. And then he never brought it up again. Calum said nothing. "I don't say this looking for sympathy," she added, because she didn't want it. "I say it because you've been," she gestured vaguely at the library, the lamp, the whole arrangement of the past 2 days. "And I want you to understand, I know this isn't real. Whatever this is, I know what it is." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "What do you think it is?" he asked. "An arrangement," she said. "Like you said." "Yes," he said, after a pause that lasted a moment too long. "Like I said. That night he didn't sit in the corridor." She noticed she lay in her too large bed and stared at the gap beneath the door, and there was no amber light. And she told herself this was the correct situation. This was what she'd said she wanted: the clear lines, the no confusion, the arrangement that stayed an arrangement. And she absolutely did not feel the specific cold of a thing being confirmed as smaller than you'd half started to imagine it might be. She slept eventually. She did not sleep well. The third day was when it went wrong. She was in the garden, mid-afternoon, Biscuit standing companionably beside her as she walked the outer path, when she heard a carriage. She turned. Through the iron gate at the estate's front, she could see it, an expensive one, black with silver detailing, and she watched it pull up, and watched the gate open, and watched a woman step out, who was everything Alara was not. She was the kind of beautiful that felt like an announcement. Everything arranged, and perfect in a way that wasn't accidental. Dark fur coat, silver jewelry, posture so flawless it seemed structural. She spoke to the gatekeeper with the ease of someone who had done this many times and found it slightly boring. Alara watched from the garden path. Then the woman looked directly at her, and smiled the kind of smile that said, "I see exactly what you are, and it doesn't concern me at all." Her name, Alara found out that evening, was Isolde Varn. She came into dinner. There was a dinner now, apparently, though no one had told Alara, already seated when Alara arrived, already in conversation with Calum in a low, easy tone that suggested long familiarity. He stood when Alara entered, which surprised her. She hadn't expected that. "My wife," he said, which was the first time she'd heard him say it, and something about the plainness of it in front of someone else made it feel more real and somehow more strange at the same time. "Alara, Isolde Varn," the woman said, extending her hand. "A vampire." Alara registered this without reacting. "I've known Calum for almost a century. Forgive the intrusion. I was in the region, and couldn't resist." "Of course," Alara said. She sat down. The dinner was long and well prepared, and Alara ate everything on her plate, and said polite things when polite things were required, and watched Isolde Varn with the specific, careful attention of someone gathering information. Isolde was charming in a way that seemed mostly genuine. She was funny, dry, quick, not trying too hard. She and Calum had the rhythm of people who knew each other deeply and had settled into something that didn't need performance. They referenced things Alara wasn't part of. Events decades old. People she'd never know. It wasn't done cruelly. It wasn't done with any apparent awareness that it might land a certain way, which was, in its own manner, worse. Alara smiled at the right moments. After dinner, when Alara said she was tired and excused herself, Calum looked at her for a fraction of a second too long. She went to her room. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the dark garden, and did not unpack her mother's poetry book, and did not try to read. She just sat there, feeling something she didn't have the right to feel, which she had specifically told herself on her wedding morning she was not going to allow. 20 minutes later, a soft knock at her door. She opened it expecting Marta. Calum stood there. No book this time, no lamp, just him, in the corridor, looking at her with something plainly visible in his expression for once. "She's not," he started. "You don't need to explain," Alara said. "You really don't." "I want to." "We have an arrangement," she said. "You told me that yourself." Something in his face shifted. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at him. "Did I?" He stopped, started again. "Did tonight bother you?" It was such a specific question, not aggressive, not rhetorical. Genuine. She wanted to say no. She'd been planning to say no. "A little," she said instead. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Good night, Alara." He walked back toward the north wing. She stood in her doorway and watched him go, and did not understand at all what that exchange had been. What it meant that he'd asked that question, or what good meant when someone said good night that way. She closed the door. She did not sleep at all. Isolde Varn stayed for 2 days. She was not cruel. That was the thing Alara kept coming back to, trying to build a reason to be simply and cleanly irritated. Isolde didn't make sharp comments or look at Alara like she was something unfortunate. She was, if anything, genuinely curious, asked Alara about her life before the estate, about what she read, about whether she found the winters in this region as relentless as they apparently were. She was good company. Under almost any other circumstances, Alara thought she might have liked her. But she watched the way Isolde existed in the estate spaces, fully, easily, without needing to learn anything, and she felt the specific smallness of someone who was still working out which doors led where. On the second morning, Alara went to the library early and found Isolde already there. "You really do love it here," Isolde said, looking up from a book she'd clearly picked up without any effort to navigate, the way you pick up a book in your own home. "I'm starting to," Alara said, which was honest. Isolde regarded her for a moment. Then she set her book down and looked at Alara with something that was surprisingly serious. "He told me about the arrangement," she said. Alara met her eyes. "All right. He told me what he said to you. On the wedding night." Isolde's mouth curved slightly. "He hasn't changed, you know. He's been saying the wrong thing first, and then spending a long time working out why it was wrong for 200 years. It's extremely inconvenient if you're around him a lot." Alara didn't know what to do with this. "Are you saying he was wrong?" "I'm saying he doesn't know yet." She picked her book back up. "He thinks he does. He has all these structures, rules he made for himself. They keep him from making mistakes." A pause. "They also keep him from quite a few things that aren't mistakes." She opened to her page. "Just so you know." Alara stood there for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because no one told me, when I should have been told, and I wasted a great deal of time." She said it without apparent bitterness, just the matter-of-fact energy of a person who had processed something and come out the other side. Think of it as one woman to another. She didn't bring it up again. Isolde left the following morning, her carriage disappearing down the frost-covered road, and the estate felt simultaneously the same and different with her gone. Alara stood in the garden watching the gate close behind the carriage and turned around to find Calum standing in the doorway to the house. They looked at each other across the garden. "Come inside," he said. "It's too cold." She came inside. There was a small sitting room on the ground floor, west-facing, that Alara hadn't spent much time in. He took her there now, lit the fire himself, which surprised her. She'd half expected someone to materialize and do it. Made her a cup of tea from the service that was already laid out, which she found she'd stopped being surprised by. Small acts of ordinary consideration that he performed without drawing attention to them. She sat on one end of the sofa. He sat in the armchair across from her. The fire was warm. Outside, thin winter sun was making a mostly unsuccessful effort. "She told me," Alara said, because it seemed simpler to just say it, "that you make rules for yourself, and that they keep you from things that aren't mistakes." He was quiet. "Is that she started? Accurate?" He looked at the fire. "Probably." He paused. "She's been telling me that for 60 years. Do you believe her?" "Not until very recently." Alara wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, Biscuit was visible through the window, standing in the far corner of the garden paddock, in the way horses did when they wanted to be clearly visible and unhurried. Alara had started to understand her. This horse, the specific vocabulary of her moods. "What happened with your sister?" she asked. She'd been not asking it since that first night in the library, letting it sit, not wanting to push. But Marta had said she needed to understand things, and she thought this was one of them. Calum was still. Not tense, exactly, more like someone who had arrived at a door they had opened before and knew the weight of it. "She was young," he said finally. Or she seemed it, even though she was 80 by then. "Some people hold their youth inside them. Saren was like that. Soft, open in a way I wasn't. He stopped. I was busy. I had territories to manage. Political things. I thought she was safe here. I thought the estate was enough." Alara waited. "She used to go to the village," he said. "The nearest one, an hour's walk. She liked it there. She knew people by name. The baker. The schoolteacher's family. I knew she went. I didn't know about the man." "What man?" "A human man. Young, she was in love with him." He said it simply. She told me. Eventually, I told her he stopped. I told her it was impossible, that it was dangerous, not for her, but for him, that people in the village would make assumptions if they saw them together, and those assumptions would put him in danger, that she was being naive. He looked at his hands. I wasn't wrong about the danger. He paused. I was brutal in how I said it. I said things about him that I didn't know were true. I said she was being childish. What happened? She stopped going to the village. She became, he searched for the word, quieter, over years. And one night she went out alone and didn't come back. A long pause. There had been hunters in the region. I hadn't told her because I hadn't thought she was going anywhere. The fire crackled. Outside, Biscuit moved to a different corner of the paddock. I'm sorry, Alara said. I have thought about it for 90 years, he said. What I should have said. How I should have I had so much time. I was 200 years old. I had all the time, and I kept telling myself there was more of it. He finally looked at her. There isn't. Usually, there isn't as much time as you think there is. Alara looked at him across the small, warm room. This ancient person with all his rules and structures, all the careful distances he maintained, sitting in his own house talking about his sister's clocks. The clocks, she said. You keep them stopped so you can't accidentally start moving time forward from when he nodded. Just once. Calum, he looked at her. You can start them again, she said. Moving forward isn't leaving her behind. It's just she thought of her father at the river. The water that kept going. You can carry people with you. You don't have to freeze. He looked at her for such a long time that she started to think she'd said something wrong. Then he said, very quietly, the coat you've been wearing. The dark wool one from the hallway. She blinked at the change of direction. Yes? It was Saren's. Oh, you can keep wearing it, he said. She would have stopped. She would have approved of you. She approved of people who said direct, true things, and she also approved of people who were kind to horses. You're both. Alara didn't say anything. The fire burned. They stayed in that room for the rest of the afternoon, and neither of them called it anything, and the space between the sofa and the armchair slowly, quietly became something neither of them was ready to name. The clocks started the next morning. Not all at once. Alara was in the corridor when she heard the first one, a low, resonant single chime from somewhere deeper in the estate. Then another, slightly higher pitched. Then, a third. She stood still listening as somewhere in the building, one by one, time began moving again, in a room that had been stopped for 90 years. She didn't say anything about it at breakfast. Neither did he. But Marta looked at Alara over the rim of her cup and gave her a very small, very significant nod. It was the 12th day of the marriage when Alara found the letters. She was in the library, in the upper level, looking for something she'd been told was there, a botany collection from the previous century that Marta had mentioned offhandedly and that Alara had been curious about ever since. She was moving along the high shelves, reading spines, when a book snagged caught against something. She pulled it free, and a small stack of envelopes came with it, dislodged from where they'd been pushed to the back of the shelf. She caught them before they fell. She would have put them back, unopened, except that the one on top had her name on it. She stood on the rolling library ladder, holding the envelope and staring at her own name in handwriting she didn't recognize. Then she got down from the ladder, sat in the chair by the reading table, and opened it. It wasn't a letter. It was 2 pages, closely written, and at the top, in that same unfamiliar handwriting, was a date from 14 years ago, and a name. It was from her mother. Alara's chest closed. She read it twice, very slowly, without knowing she was holding her breath. Her mother had been here, at this estate, 14 years ago, before the debts, before everything. There had been a meeting, her mother writing about a visit, about the grounds, about speaking with someone at the estate who had been unexpectedly kind. She wrote about the garden. She wrote about a man who had sat with her in the library for a long afternoon and talked about books, and said nothing hollow or empty the way people usually did when they didn't know what to say to a grieving person. She had been grieving. Elara's grandfather had just died. She'd come to the estate for the letter, didn't explain why. Official business, something about a trade agreement involving her father's company. She'd come alone and stayed 2 days, and apparently Calum had known her mother. Elara sat in the library for a long time after she finished reading. She found him in his study. He was at his desk, looking at papers, and he looked up when she came in. His expression shifted immediately. Something in her face was telling him something. She held out the letters without saying anything. He looked at them. And she watched the color of something in his expression change, not guilt. Exactly. But recognition. He had known she would find them, maybe, or had thought about whether she would. He set down his pen. "Your mother came here 14 years ago," he said. Not a question. She was managing some of the trade arrangements for your father's company. He paused. She stayed longer than required. She was grieving, and she didn't want to go back to a house full of people yet. "You knew her," Elara said. "We spoke for 2 days. In the library, mostly. He was choosing words carefully, precisely. She talked about her father, yours. She talked about her children." He paused. "She talked about you." Elara's throat had closed entirely. "What did she say?" He looked at her directly. "She said she had a daughter who was braver than she knew, who would be all right even when things were difficult, because she had a quality that was harder to break than it looked." He paused. "She said this daughter didn't believe it about herself yet, which she found the most heartbreaking part." Elara had to look away. "She left the letters," he said. She said he stopped. He picked up his pen and set it down again. "She said someday you might need to hear things from her that she didn't know how to say in person. She asked me to keep them here, in the library, where you'd find them if he stopped again. I didn't arrange the marriage," he said. "I want you to be clear on that. When your father came to me with the debt, I could have handled it differently. I didn't know who you were to her. It was only when the contract was finalized, when I saw your name, he went quiet." Elara turned back to face him. "You knew my name from her letters." "Yes, and you didn't say anything." "I didn't know how." He said it plainly, without defense. "You arrived and you were not what I expected, in ways I couldn't articulate, and I had spent 14 years wondering occasionally what her brave, difficult daughter had become, and then she was standing in my entrance hall in a dress that didn't fit." She stared at him. "Why did you say it?" she asked. "That first night. I will never touch you." "The arrangement. Why did you lead with that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I meant it when I said it." He met her eyes. "And because you were clearly someone who had made herself very small to survive the past few years, and I thought the most important thing was to make sure you knew you had space, that this was yours on your own terms. So it wasn't you weren't setting a distance for yourself." "I was doing both," he said. "I was trying to do both things at once. And one of them," he stopped. "One of them was more honest than the other. The study was very quiet." "She wrote about the garden," Elara said finally. "In the letter. She said it would be beautiful in spring. It is." His voice was different now. "Quieter, I'll show you. When it's time." She looked down at the letters in her hands, her mother's handwriting, that small, careful word, yes, in the margin of a poem. All the things that hadn't been said in the right rooms at the right times. "She would have liked knowing," Elara said, "that I ended up here." "I think she did know," he said. "Or hoped. Why else leave them here?" Elara pressed the letters to her chest for a moment, holding them like something that might be fragile or might not be. Then she set them carefully on the edge of his desk. "I'm going to go sit in the garden," she said. "I'll be fine. I just need to take Saren's coat," he said. She nodded. She was almost at the door when he said her name. She turned. He was still at his desk, looking at her with that expression she had stopped trying to name because every name she came up with felt too small. "She was right," he said, about the braver-than-she-knew part. Elara walked out of the study and down the corridor and into the cold garden and stood in the dead winter grass in a dead woman's coat and cried quietly for a few minutes with nobody watching, which was exactly what she needed. Then she sat on the stone bench and watched the sky and breathed. By the time she went back inside, something had settled. Not solved. Not finished. Settled, the way snow settles, changing the shape of everything it covers into something softer and more bearable. January became February the way it always did, reluctantly, the cold refusing to acknowledge the new month even as the light started arriving a few minutes earlier each morning. Elara started noticing it first from the library windows, that the sky wasn't quite dark anymore by the time Marta put out the breakfast things. A thin gray light before the actual sunrise, like the day clearing its throat before it spoke. She and Calum had developed, without discussing it, a life that had shape to it. Breakfast separately, usually, though sometimes she arrived in the kitchen to find him already there, and they ate together with the newspaper she'd started having delivered from the city, which he read half of and she read the other half, and they occasionally read things aloud to each other if they were interesting enough. She had learned he had strong opinions about trade policy and almost no patience for society gossip, and he had learned she read the arts section first and skipped the financial pages entirely. "You should read the financial section," he told her one morning. "Tell me if anything important happens," she said without looking up from a review of an exhibition she was now planning to go see. "That's not," he stopped. "You're very comfortable ignoring things you find boring. I find it's an important skill." He looked at her for a moment over the top of his half of the newspaper. She couldn't tell if he was annoyed or amused. She was starting to understand that this was sometimes both simultaneously. She had gone to the village. She'd done it without asking, without announcing it, one afternoon when the weather was relatively cooperative, and Biscuit was feeling energetic. She'd ridden out and spent 2 hours in the nearest village looking at things: a small bookshop, a bakery, a general store that sold everything from rope to dried flowers. She'd bought bread and a small jar of honey and a map of the local roads, not because she planned to leave but because she liked maps, which she was slowly realizing about herself. When she came back, he was at the gate, not waiting. She was clear about that. He was doing something to the latch that may or may not have needed doing, in a way that meant he happened to be in a position to see her arrive. "You went to the village," he said. "Yes," she dismounted. "Is that no?" "No. It's he took Biscuit's reins, which was what she'd expected a groom to do, and he did it with the practiced ease of someone who had actually spent time around horses, despite claiming not to ride. I just didn't know you'd gone. Did you need to know?" He looked at Biscuit in a way that was clearly about Elara. "No," he said. "I got bread," she said, "from the baker. She said to tell you, and I'm quoting, that your last order of the dark grain flour was perfect, and if you change suppliers again, she will personally come here and complain about it in detail." Something crossed his face that was unmistakably the ghost of a smile. "That's Hedda," he said. "She's been saying that for 30 years. You order flour from the village baker. The estate kitchen prefers it." He handed Biscuit off to the groom, who had appeared. "Come inside. You look cold." She came inside. He knew the baker's name. She turned this over in the days after. He sent the flour order. He knew her name, knew her preferred words, had been absorbing that small piece of a specific woman's 30-year personality. He was. She was coming to understand, someone who paid attention in very quiet ways that he never drew attention to. He remembered things what she read, what she skipped, that she took her tea too strong by most people's standards, that Biscuit responded better when you didn't rush the approach. She didn't think he knew he was doing it. She brought it up one evening when they were in the sitting room, the fire going, the window showing a sky that was finally holding dark blue instead of pure black. Small progress. "Do you know you collect details?" she asked. He looked up from his maps. "What?" "About people. You notice things, and you keep them." She tucked her feet up on the sofa. "The baker's opinions. The groom's method with nervous horses. What I read in the mornings. You collect it, and you hold it, and I don't think you think of it as anything in particular." He was quiet. "It's interesting," she said, "because you seem from the outside like someone who keeps people at a distance, but you're actually paying very close attention. It's just private." He set the map down. "Is that—" She paused. "Am I wrong?" "No," he said. "You're not wrong." He looked at the fire. "My mother was like that. She said attention was the most sincere form of caring, that half the cruelty in the world came from people failing to actually look." A pause. "I suppose I kept that." "Your mother sounds remarkable," he said simply. "Yes," Alara looked at him. February light, firelight, a man 263 years old, talking about his mother in the present tense in the way people did when they hadn't fully accepted the past tense. "Tell me something about her," she said. He thought for a moment. Not deflecting, actually thinking. "She refused to call herself a vampire," he said, "even after she turned. She said it was a word other people had invented for what she was, and she didn't see why she had to use it." A hint of warmth in his voice. "She said she was just herself, and herself happened to be something that had lived for a very long time and had inconvenient dietary habits." Alara laughed. A real one. Surprised out of her. He looked at her when she laughed. He'd started doing that just looking, when she laughed unexpectedly. Like he was noting something. "She would have liked you," he said, which was the same thing he'd said about Saren, and it landed differently this time. Less like comfort and more like something deliberate. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it." She looked at him. "Calum." "Yes, what's happening here?" The fire crackled. Outside, a light snow had started, which they hadn't expected. Small flakes against the dark window. He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know how to answer that carefully," he said finally, "and I don't trust myself to answer it carelessly." "Then, answer it honestly." He was quiet. He stopped. "Tried again. I find I want to know everything," he said. "What you'll think of the garden in spring. Whether you'll keep coming to the library every morning for the next." He stopped again. "For the next, how long?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "That's the careless part," he said. The snow came down outside the warm sitting room window. She looked at it for a moment, then back at him. "I want to stay," she said. Not as a response to what he'd implied, just as its own true thing. "I came here thinking it was." She searched for the word, a destination, something that had happened to me, but it's starting to feel more like a place. He was looking at her with an expression she had finally found a name for. It was the expression of someone who had stopped bracing for the thing they'd been afraid of for a very long time. "Good," he said. "Just that." She looked back at the snow. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm starting from the K section of the library. Will you tell me which ones are worth reading?" "That will take weeks," he said. "There are several hundred books in the K section." "I know," she said. He picked up his maps again. She opened her book. The snow fell outside, quiet and indifferent. and inside the sitting room, the fire burned, and two people sat in comfortable separate silence that had quietly become the best part of both their days. She got sick in the middle of February. Nothing dramatic. A cold, probably from the rides in the early mornings when the air still had real bite to it, or from the day she'd been caught in the rain coming back from the village and been properly soaked before she made it back to the stable. Her throat started hurting on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning her head was thick, and her eyes felt like they'd been packed with cotton, and she was unreasonably, furiously annoyed at her own body for doing this now. She came to breakfast anyway. Marta looked at her. "Go back to bed. I'm fine. You're not fine. Go back to bed. I just need tea in your room. Go." Marta pointed at the door with the certainty of someone who had been the definitive voice in this kitchen for 40 years and was not changing that now. Alara went. She spent the day in her room being quietly miserable, which she found she hated. Being ill alone was one of the stranger kinds of loneliness. Everything required slightly more effort than usual, and there was no particular reason to make that effort, and the hours were very long. She read badly, dozed in the armchair. Got cold, moved to the bed, got too hot. The lavender jar from her bag was on the dresser, and she opened it just to smell it and thought about the house she'd grown up in. Before everything, when illness meant her mother appearing in the doorway with the specific tea that tasted medicinal and slightly sweet, and her father making too much noise trying to be quiet in the hallway outside. Nobody was making noise in the hallway outside. She didn't expect them to. She was an adult. She had managed being unwell by herself for years. This was fine. Around 4 in the afternoon, there was a knock at her door. She pulled herself upright. "Come in." Calum opened the door and stood in the frame looking at her in a way that contained approximately 12 things he was visibly not saying. He was carrying a tray. She stared at it. "Marta's tea," he said, and he glanced at the tray. "Some bread. The plain kind. She said that's what's best." He paused, and I found this. He held up a book she recognized. It was from the library. A novel she'd mentioned, briefly, 3 days ago, something she'd said she'd been meaning to reread since she'd read it first as a teenager. She'd mentioned it, in passing, that specific careless way you mention things you don't expect anyone to register. He had registered it. He crossed the room and set the tray on the nightstand and placed the book on top of it. Then he straightened up and looked at her with that same expression of 12 unsaid things. "Are you?" He stopped. "You should sleep." "I have been sleeping," she said. "I'm bored of sleeping." "You look terrible." "Thank you," she said. "That's very helpful." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed and sat in it and said, "I could read to you, if you want. Or I can go." She stared at him. He looked back, very still, not pressing. "You'd read to me?" she said. I read aloud occasionally. When Saren was, he stopped. Started differently. I used to. I haven't for a long time. "But if it would help you sleep, it's something I can." "Yes," she said. He picked up the novel from the tray. Found the beginning. He had, she discovered in the next hour, a very good reading voice. Low and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who actually understood what they were reading, rather than just producing sounds. He read the first 2 chapters, and she lay back against her pillows and felt the tight, miserable tension of the day slowly loosen, and her eyes grew heavy, not from boredom, but from a completely different thing. She woke up at some point to find the room darker, and him still sitting in the chair beside the bed, not reading anymore, just sitting there, with the closed book in his lap. "You stayed," she said. Her voice was thick from sleep. "You were finally sleeping properly," he said. "I didn't want to wake you. How long? An hour?" He stood. I'll get you more tea. The temperature in here has he glanced at the window. You need more wood on the fire. He fixed the fire. He brought tea. He brought, for reasons she didn't ask about, a second blanket that was heavier than the first one and that smelled like cedar, and she bundled herself into it and drank the tea and felt measurably more human. He sat back in the chair. You don't have to stay, she said. I know. He stayed. They didn't talk much. She was too tired for real conversation, and he seemed to understand that, not trying to fill the space or entertain her or require anything from her. He sat and occasionally read a few pages aloud, and occasionally was just quiet. And it was, she thought, distantly, like being held without being touched. Like someone building a wall around a space and saying, "This is yours. You're safe. Nothing will get in here tonight." She thought about what Marta had said, watching him for 40 years, not let a single person past that distance. She thought about Isolde saying the rules he'd made for himself kept him from things that weren't mistakes. She thought about a first night in the Great Hall, a man saying, "I will never touch you," in a voice that had cost him something to use. "You're thinking loudly," he said. "Sorry, don't be." He turned a page he wasn't really reading. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the ceiling. "The first night," she said. "What you said. Do you still mean it?" "The arrangement. The distance." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant it when I said it," he said. "I told you that." "And now?" He looked at her. In the firelight, in the specific intimacy of a room where someone was unwell and another person had chosen to stay, he looked different from how he looked in any other room. More present. More unguarded. "Now," he said, slowly, "I think I may have made a rule that made sense for the man I was 2 months ago, and significantly less sense for the man I am now. Which man is that?" He looked at the fire, one who spent an hour sitting in a chair listening to someone breathe, and found it was the best hour of his week. Alara was very still. "That's a small thing to find meaningful," she said carefully. "Yes," he agreed. 2 months ago I would have found that concerning. Now I think he stopped. I think maybe small things are what it's made of. Actually, the real version of it. The real version of what? He didn't answer immediately. "Whatever this is turning into," he said. She looked at him in the firelight, this person who carried centuries like stones in a coat, who had made himself careful and distant and structured because the alternative was too costly, who had sat outside her door with a lamp and a book of maps on her first night here because some part of him remembered how. "Calum," she said. "Yes, I think you can move the chair a little closer." He looked at her for a moment. Then, he moved the chair, just slightly, closer to where she was. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed quietly. She slept again. Properly, warm, and oddly peaceful. And when she woke in the morning, the chair was empty, but there was fresh wood on the fire, and the blanket was still around her. And the book was on her nightstand, a small piece of folded paper marking the place he'd stopped reading. She opened it. In his handwriting, 2 words. "Feel better." She held the paper for a long time. She was better by Friday. He was different after that, in ways she couldn't quite measure, but kept noticing. Small things. He started coming to the library earlier, which meant they overlapped more. He started asking questions, not polite ones, real ones, the kind that required actual thought to answer. What was the best book she'd ever read, and why specifically? Not what it was about, but what it did to her. What she'd wanted to be as a child before the world started having opinions about it. Whether she'd been happy in her life before this, not asking for a neat answer, but asking in the way of someone who wanted the complicated real version. She asked him things back. She found out he had tried, once, to write poetry. In the 16th century, when he'd been going through what he described, with a straight face, as a difficult period. She found out the poetry had been, his word, catastrophic, and that he had burned all of it and was only willing to admit it had existed at all because she'd told him about a deeply unfortunate incident in which she'd tried to paint a portrait of Biscuit, and it had come out looking like a small, disturbed rectangle with legs. "So, we've both made artistic mistakes," she said. "Mine were worse," he said. "I'd like to judge that for myself. The evidence has been destroyed." Conveniently, he looked at her with the expression she'd come to love, which wasn't a smile, but was something that lived in the same neighborhood as one. "The word you're looking for," he said, "is wisely." She laughed. He watched her laugh. The garden started showing things. Very faint, very small the first week of March, brought a thin green thread at the base of one of the dormant rose bushes, and she found it on her afternoon walk and crouched down to look at it for so long that Biscuit came over and nudged her shoulder to check if she was still functional. She told Calum at dinner. His face did something quiet and warm when she said it. "It's the first one every year," he said. "Saren used to watch for it. She must have loved spring. She loved potential," he said. "The idea that something could be dead all winter and still know what it was supposed to do." He looked at his plate. She said it was the most hopeful thing in the world. Alara looked at the window. She was right, she said. He looked at her. "The most hopeful thing," she said, meeting his eyes. Yes, they stayed with that for a moment. The difficult thing happened the following week, when a delegation arrived from one of the Eastern Territories, 3 vampires. Official business. Something about a treaty negotiation that had been ongoing for months. Calum became someone slightly different when they arrived, more formal, more distant. The careful, deliberate version of himself that she'd first met in the Great Hall 3 months ago. She understood it. She just found she missed the other version. She attended the formal dinner that first night, sat at the table that was too long, in the dress that now fit her because she'd had all her clothes properly adjusted in January, and she was introduced as Calum's wife, and she smiled the right smiles and said the right things. One of the delegation, a man named Oren, older seeming than the others, with the very specific quality of someone who had been important for a very long time and found this appropriate, kept looking at her with a particular expression. Assessing. Not hostile exactly. Just measuring. Partway through the meal, he said, directed at Calum but looking at her, the human bride. "I heard she was a settlement arrangement." There was a short silence. "The correct word," Calum said, in a voice that was extremely even, "is my wife." "Of course." Oren's smile didn't quite reach anything. "I meant no disrespect." "I know," Calum said. "I'm clarifying for future use." Alara picked up her wine glass. She didn't react. Didn't give Oren the specific satisfaction of watching her react. She was the daughter of a man who had been having meals where people said things that required absorbing quietly since she was 8 years old. She was good at this. But her hand was slightly tighter on the stem than necessary. After dinner, during the brief formal gathering before the delegation retired, Calum appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He simply stood next to her with his arm just touching hers the smallest possible contact and stayed there. It wasn't performance. There was no one watching particularly. He just stood there, beside her, and she felt the specific quality of not being alone in a room that wanted her to feel small. Later, when the delegation had gone to their rooms and the formal evening was over, they were in the corridor that branched toward north and east wings, and she stopped walking. "Thank you," she said. "For don't," he said, not sharply. "Don't thank me for that." Calum, what Oren said was ignorant and dismissive, he said, quietly and without apparent heat, and he stopped. "I should have been clearer from the beginning of the evening, in how I introduced you. I was trying to manage the politics, and he looked at her. I should have been clearer." She looked at him. This man who gave himself very specific responsibilities and catalogued his own failures with the precision of someone who intended to do better. "You were clear when it mattered," she said. He was quiet. He stopped. "Tried again." "You keep being more patient than I, Calum," she said. He looked at her. She was standing in the corridor with the lamplight making the stone walls amber around them, and she was looking at this person who had spent 200 years making careful rules that kept him safe, and had quietly, over 3 months, been taking them apart one by one without quite saying so. "Come have tea with me," she said. "It's late." "I know." He came. They sat in the small sitting room, again, the one that had become theirs without a conversation about it. The fire. The window with the garden outside. She made the tea herself this time, because Marta had long since gone to bed, and she made it too strong the way she always did, and he drank it without comment, which made her inexplicably pleased. "Tell me something you've never said out loud," she said. He looked at his cup. "That's you asked me things all week," she said. I answered them honestly. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm frightened," he said finally, almost constantly, "of losing things." He looked at the fire. "I have lost enough that it feels." He stopped. I thought the answer was not having things to lose. Keep everything at a distance. Manage things. Maintain arrangements. He looked at her. That was a very well constructed and completely wrong answer. She looked at him. "How long have you known it was wrong?" she asked. He looked at her, steady, unguarded, the firelight across his face. "Since about the second morning," he said, "when you came down to the kitchen and sat on the stool and told Marta you were fine when you clearly weren't." She laughed, surprised. "That specific moment?" "I thought," he said, "there she is. That's the person I'm going to have to completely rethink everything for." He paused. It was very inconvenient. She looked at him across the small table, in the warm room, in the house she had come to as a destination and had become her place, and felt something that was past being careful. "Calum," she said, "I don't want an arrangement." He was very still. "I know," he said, "and I don't think you do either." "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The fire burned. "So what do we do about that?" she asked. He looked at her with the expression she had named, finally, that morning in the library, the one she'd been waiting to see settle in properly. "I'm going to ask you something," he said carefully, "and I want you to actually think about it before you answer. Not the polite answer, the real one." She nodded. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "Not because of the arrangement, not because of your father's debt. Because you want to be here. Specifically here." She didn't need to think. "Yes," she said. Something in him shifted, like a thing he'd been holding very carefully was finally allowed to be set down. "Then," he said, "we build something real." He kissed her 2 weeks later. Not dramatically. They were in the library, where all the things that mattered seemed to happen between them, and she had been reading him something from a collection of old letters she'd found on the shelves, correspondence between 2 botanists across a century, unlikely and specific, and somehow charming, and she'd looked up to find him looking at her instead of listening to the words. She'd stopped reading. He'd said, "Can I?" She'd said yes. It was quiet and unhurried and tasted like the tea she'd made too strong, and it was, she thought, afterward, exactly what she would have wanted if she'd known what to want. He pressed his forehead to hers after and said nothing for a long moment. "Then, I've been thinking about doing that since the second week." "Only the second week?" she said. He laughed. A real one, which still surprised her every time because it changed his whole face, took away all the centuries and left something younger and genuine and completely unguarded. "The first week," he admitted, "I was still trying to convince myself it was an arrangement. And the second week?" "The second week you told me about Saren's coat," he said, and I completely stopped convincing myself. She looked at him. "You carried her coat this whole time," she said, "for 90 years, and you let me wear it." "Yes, that," she stopped. "That's not a small thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Spring arrived properly in March, green and abrupt the way it sometimes came, like it had been waiting backstage and finally got its cue. The garden transformed in what felt like 2 weeks the dormant shapes she'd been walking past all winter suddenly, with purpose, with color, with the specific industry of plants that had simply been biding their time. He took her through the garden on the first warm morning, walked beside her on the same path she'd been walking alone since January, and named things. The climbing roses on the east wall that had been Saren's project. The old apple trees at the far end that had been there when the estate was built. A small section near the stone bench where her mother had apparently sat on the visit 14 years ago and said the garden would be beautiful in spring. She was right, Alara said. She generally was, he said. Alara stopped in the center of the garden and turned slowly, looking at all of it. Biscuit had wandered over to the fence and was watching them with the placid interest of a horse that had decided to adopt 2 humans. The sky was a very uncomplicated blue. Everything was alive and actively demonstrating it. She thought about the girl who had sat in a black carriage on a frozen morning and packed 1 bag and decided not to feel anything. She thought she wouldn't recognize this. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm glad it was me," she said, "in the carriage. I'm glad it was my name on the contract." He looked at her for a long moment. "So am I," he said. "Every day more than the day before. So am I." The delegation left in the 2nd week of March, and the estate returned to itself. She had started to understand the estate's personality now, the way it had moods, the way the light in the library was different on cloudy days, in a way she'd come to specifically like, the way Marta organized the kitchen around seasons, the particular quiet of a Sunday morning when even the household staff moved a little slower. She had started thinking of it as home without noticing the exact moment it happened. She wrote to her sister, not to her father. She wasn't ready for that, and she was finding that not being ready for something was something she was allowed these days. But Priya had written her twice, letters that were tentative in a way Priya's letters never were, and Alara sat one afternoon and wrote back honestly. Not everything, but honestly. She wrote that she was well, that the estate was large and strange, and had a horse named Biscuit, that she had found things here she hadn't expected to find. She wrote, "I think I'm happy. I don't think I've been able to write that in a very long time." She sealed the letter and felt lighter. Calum found her later in the day sitting in the garden with her face tilted toward the sun. He sat beside her on the bench. They'd taken to sitting here in the late afternoon when his meetings were finished, and her reading was done, and the garden was catching the last of the day's warmth. "You wrote a letter," he said. "To Priya." She didn't open her eyes. "My sister." Good, she didn't know what they'd done, Alara said. Or maybe she half knew and didn't let herself know properly. I think she feels guilty. Do you want her to?" Alara thought about it honestly. "Not anymore," she said. "I did for a while, but it feels like carrying weight that doesn't actually help me." She tilted her face back down and looked at the apple trees at the end of the garden. "Your father. After your mother died. Did he come back from it?" Calum was quiet for a moment. "He did," he said. Eventually, he found other things to say. He paused. It took time. Real time, not the kind you push through, the kind you wait through. Is there a difference? Yes, pushing through means you get to the other side still carrying everything. Waiting through means you put it down while you're waiting, and when you get up you don't automatically pick it all back up again. She looked at him. "Where did you learn that?" "I had to figure it out about myself," he said. "After Saren. I pushed through for about 40 years and arrived on the other side completely unchanged and very tired. He looked at his hands. Then I stopped. Actually waited. And something shifted. The clocks, she said. The clocks, he agreed, among other things. She reached over and put her hand over his, not dramatic, just a hand on a hand, in the afternoon sun, in a garden that had finally come back from winter. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there for a long time. "I'm going to ask you something," she said eventually. "All right. The first night. What you said." She paused. "I will never touch you. You meant it as a promise that I was safe, that this was mine on my terms." "Yes," he said. "And you spent the whole night awake outside my door." He was quiet. "Because you were already," she stopped. Even then, he said quietly. "I know that's no," she said. "I'm not." She turned to look at. "I'm saying I understand it now. Why you said it and what it cost you and what you were doing. You were giving me the room. Giving me the time." She looked at their hands. "The whole night awake outside my door because you were already." She shook her head. "Softly, Caleb. That might be the most." She stopped. He was looking at her. "The most what?" he asked, quietly. She shook her head again. She didn't have the right word. She thought about what he'd said about his father, 200 years of silence, because everything left to say had been for one person. She thought about maps and how they showed you everywhere something leads. She thought about a river not choosing where to go, just moving. Because stopping means freezing. "It was the most you," she said finally. "That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved very slightly over the back of her hand. "Yes," he said. It was. The garden was warm and full of living things, and Biscuit was still watching them from the fence with aristocratic disapproval, and the sky was the kind of late afternoon blue that doesn't last long but is worth paying attention to while it does. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He stayed completely still, the way a person did when they were afraid that moving would end something they hadn't dared hope for. Then, he rested his head against hers. And they sat there. She found out about the debt by accident. It was April, and she was in Caleb's study. She went there sometimes in the mornings, when the library felt too much like being alone, and too little like being somewhere, and she was looking through a stack of estate correspondence he'd said she could read if she was curious about how things worked. She was curious. She was becoming, slowly, someone who wanted to understand this place she lived in and how it sustained itself and who all the people in it were. The debt records were in the lower drawer. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been looking for a map she'd seen there once, an old one that showed the territory from 2 centuries ago and how the borders had shifted. She opened the wrong drawer and saw her father's name. She sat down in the chair. She read the document carefully. When Caleb came into the study an hour later, she was still sitting in the same position with the document in her hands. He saw immediately. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up at him. "The debt," she said. "It's been cleared." He didn't say anything. "It's dated January," she said. 3 weeks after I arrived. She looked at the document again. "You cleared it. The whole thing. You didn't tell me." He came in fully. He sat in the chair across from her. He had the expression of someone who had thought about how this conversation might happen and still wasn't entirely ready for it. "It wasn't a condition," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. It was never going to be a condition." "You cleared my father's entire debt," she said. "Yes, why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it felt wrong," he said, "to have your presence here tied to something he did. It felt like he looked for the word, like a leash, and I didn't want there to be a leash." He looked at her steadily. "You should be here because you choose to be here, not because your father owes me something. The moment I understood that clearly, I resolved the debt." She looked at the document. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have. Why didn't you?" He was honest, because I was afraid it would change something, that you'd feel differently, about whether you were here by choice or by obligation. He paused, which was exactly the kind of control I was trying to release. "I know that." She set the document down. "So I could have left," she said. "Since January. There was nothing holding me here. There was never anything holding you here," he said quietly. "Not really. I told you from the beginning the door was yours." She looked at him. "Calum," she said. "I know that." He looked at her. "I know the door was mine," she said. "I knew it in February. I knew it when I went to the village and came back. I knew it when Isolde came and went, and I stayed." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm not upset that the debt is cleared. I'm upset that you carried that by yourself for 4 months when she gestured at everything. When we've been building this." He was very still. "I didn't want you to feel obligated to thank me," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I know every careful, worried thing you were thinking when you decided not to tell me. I can see all of them." She looked at him. "But I need you to understand that this she gestured again requires you to let me in on things, not the political things, not the estate things, the things that are actually about us." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "Just that. No defense, no negotiation. I know, you're right." She picked up the document and set it on the corner of the desk and said, "Thank you for clearing it." It was she stopped. "It matters that you thought about the leash." She looked at him. "I know what that means about how you think about me and I." She stopped again. "Tell me," he said. She looked at her hands. "I've spent a long time being someone people arranged things around," she said, without asking. "My father arranged the marriage. My life was arranged around my sister's better prospects. And somewhere in the last 4 months I have become someone that someone thinks about. Actually thinks about." She met his eyes. "You think about what I need before I've said it. You clear the leash before I even see it. She stopped. "I'm not used to being thought about." He looked at her steadily. "Get used to it," he said. "Not a command, a promise." She breathed. "All right," she said. They sat together in the study for a while after that, not doing anything in particular, just being in the same room in the way that had become one of her favorite things, without her quite tracking when it had become that. Then she said, "The map. The old one with the territory borders. Where is it?" He pointed at the top drawer. She found it, spread it on the desk between them. He came around to stand beside her, and they leaned over it together, his shoulder against hers. And he started explaining where the borders had been, why they'd moved, what had happened in the 100 years between the map's date and the present. She asked questions. He answered them. She asked more questions. He got out a newer map and put it beside the old one and showed her the comparison, and then somehow they were 40 minutes deep into the history of a border dispute from a century and a half ago, and she was completely absorbed in it. And she turned to say something and found his face very close to hers and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Tell me the rest later," she said. "There's something more important I want to do." He smiled. A full one this time, real and unhurried, with nothing underneath it but itself. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and his hands were in her hair, which she found she had opinions about good ones, and the maps on the desk showed the shape of all the land he'd spent centuries knowing, all the places everything led, all the roads with their definite ends, and in the center of all of it, in this study, in this estate, in this life she had arrived at from somewhere else, 2 people were finding, as simply as breathing, exactly where they had always been going. Summer came gently. Not all at once, but in pieces a warm afternoon here, Then a cold morning that reminded you not to assume. Then 2 warm days together. Then 3, until eventually you looked up and realized the estate was green, and the roses on the east wall were in full riot, and Biscuit had started standing in the shade in the afternoons, rather than the sun. Alara had a routine now. She understood the word differently than she had before. A routine used to feel like walls the same day repeating. No exit, no surprise. Now it felt like the opposite. Like a shape you'd built yourself, deliberately, from things you actually wanted. The library in the mornings. Marta's kitchen. The garden in the afternoon. The bench by the apple trees. The hour before dinner when the light went sideways, and gold across the grass. Calum in the evenings. Always Calum in the evenings. She had learned to read the versions of him now. The version that came to dinner with his mind still full of estate business he'd eat, and she'd talk and he'd follow the conversation about 60%, while the other 40 worked on whatever political thing was sitting with him, and she'd learned to just let that be what it was, because he always came back fully by the time the tea was poured. The version that had been to the village and come back carrying more warmth than usual, having talked to Hedda about flour, or stopped to see the schoolteacher's children, who apparently adored him in a way that he found completely baffling. The version that came to find her in the library with no particular purpose, and simply sat down, and was close to her as its own sufficient reason. That was her favorite version. She'd never told him that. She thought she might one day. On a Saturday in June, her sister came. Priya had written asking if she could visit, a letter that had been very carefully worded, in a way that made clear she was not sure she'd be welcome, which had made Alara ache a little. She had written back and said yes immediately, and spent the next 2 weeks not thinking about it too carefully. Calum had asked, the evening before Priya arrived, if she was all right. "I think so," she'd said. "I think it'll be fine. I think I just need to see her face." "That's enough reason," he said. Priya arrived in the morning, in a carriage that was considerably less dramatic than the one Alara had arrived in, and stood in the front drive looking at the estate, with an expression Alara recognized the specific look of something being larger than expected. They stood across from each other for a moment. Then Priya said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like yourself," her sister said, and her voice cracked slightly on it, and Alara stepped forward, and they held each other for a long moment in the drive of this estate that had started as an ending and had become, instead, a beginning. "I'm sorry," Priya said into her shoulder. "I should have when Father said you'd be the one to go. I should have. You couldn't have stopped it," Alara said. "I know that. I didn't even try." No. Alara stepped back and looked at her sister properly. The sister who had always occupied more space and more attention, and more of their parents' limited warmth, who had probably never known quite how much of it she took. "But I don't think you knew what you were doing, Priya. Not really. You just lived in the world you were given." Her sister looked at her. "We all do that," Alara said. "Until we don't." Calum met Priya at lunch. He was, Alara watched, very deliberately ordinary, none of the formal weight he carried in official settings, no political distance, just himself. He asked Priya about the city. He poured her tea. He mentioned, because he had clearly decided to mention it on purpose, that Alara had told him about the horse portraits, and Priya had looked between them and then laughed and said the horse portraits had been a low point in a creative career that had thankfully not progressed. Alara watched her sister look at him, watched the thing shift in her expression. The recalibration. After lunch, when Calum had excused himself to give them time, Priya said, "I expected I don't know what I expected." "A monster," Alara said. "Or at least someone cold." Priya looked toward the garden. "He's not cold. No, he kept topping up your tea without you asking. He does that." Her sister looked at her. "Alara, I know," she said. "Are you happy?" She thought about January mornings in the kitchen. A lamp on the corridor floor. a book of maps, a coat that smelled like cedar, a voice reading aloud in the afternoon dark, 2 words on a folded piece of paper. Feel better. Yes, she said. Properly, for the first time in a very long time. Priya was quiet. Then, Mother would have liked this. All of this. I know, Alara said. She already did, actually. She told Priya about the letters then, in the garden in the afternoon sun. And Priya cried, and Alara held her hand, and Biscuit came, and stood nearby being large and warmly indifferent in the way that horses had of being comforting without trying. Priya left the next morning with a different expression than she'd arrived with. She promised to write more. She looked at the estate from the carriage window as it pulled away and raised her hand, and Alara raised hers back, and then the gate closed. Calum came to stand beside her. "All right?" he said. "Yes." She turned from the gate. "Better than I expected, actually." They walked back toward the house. The morning was warm, unhurried, the roses on the east wall fully open now, the apple trees that Saren had loved casting proper shade on the grass below. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the clocks." She glanced at him. "You started them all, but there's one in the sitting room that still runs about 3 minutes slow. I think the mechanism needs adjusting." He looked at her. "I noticed," he said, "about 6 weeks ago. And I thought I'd leave it. A little." He said it the way he said things that cost him something. 3 minutes. As if she's still just slightly behind me. Somewhere. Still coming. She stopped walking. She looked at him. This ancient person, with his careful structures and his long memory and his absolute precision about everything, except the one room where a clock ran slow by 3 minutes and always had. "All right," she said. "We leave that one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way you take the hand of someone who is yours. They walked back into the estate, through the door and into the entrance hall where she had first stood in a borrowed dress in January, small and frightened, and almost entirely certain this would be the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The morning light came through the windows and lay in long gold rectangles across the floor. Somewhere in the estate, 12 clocks that had stood still for 90 years marked the hour with purpose, and one clock in the sitting room ran 3 minutes slow and always would. Alara thought about all the things that had led her here, her father's failures, her mother's letters left in a library, a carriage on a frozen road, a man saying "I will never touch you" in a great hall, while clearly meaning something more complicated than the words. She thought about the river, not choosing where to go, just moving, because stopping means freezing. She was not frozen. She was, she thought, very thoroughly moving. "The East Library shelves," she said, as they crossed the entrance hall. "I've finished the K section." "I know," he said. "I noticed the books migrating. I want to start a list," she said, "of the ones worth reading twice. Can we do that tonight?" He looked at her with the expression she had named, finally. That first morning in the library, when she'd watched it settle into something permanent. The expression of a man who had stopped bracing for loss and started, carefully, slowly, with considerable attention and some uncertainty, building something else. "Yes," he said. "Tonight and tomorrow night, if the list runs long." "It'll run long," she said. "I suspected as much." He almost smiled. "I'm not complaining." She smiled back. They went into the library, their library, and the morning light moved across the shelves, and all the shelves moved through the day, and outside the roses stayed open, and the apple trees stayed shaded, and Biscuit wandered contentedly, and the clocks, 11 of them, keeping perfect time. One, keeping almost perfect time, marked the hours in a house that was, finally, entirely full of living.